Oh, good morning. It's good to have everyone back. We're back in the book of Ruth this morning, verse number 1 again. Now, last week we were introduced to the book of Ruth. Ruth takes place in the days when the judges ruled, a time marked by a tragic cycle of dysfunction, rebellion, and sin. Israel would rebel against God. God would allow foreign nations to rise up and take Israel into bondage. The people would cry out. God, being full of mercy, would forgive them and then raise up a judge who would deliver them. Eventually, that judge would die, and the next generation would rebel against God, and that rebellion was greater, was worse than the generation before. Now, this fact led us to ask the hard question, why did each generation grow worse? One of the reasons was painfully simple, because the older generation neglected their responsibility to teach the younger the ways of the Lord. Faith was not passed on. Truth was not preserved. And when one generation fails to anchor the next, the drift becomes inevitable. This was the world of Ruth. A world of spiritual confusion, moral decline, and national instability. And yet, right in the middle of that darkness, God was quietly weaving a story of redemption. And that story was being weaved through the lives of ordinary people. And as I've studied out Ruth, I think that's become more and more evident to me, just how God worked out the redemption, in fact, of all humanity, because through the lineage of Ruth comes David and eventually Jesus Christ. But it started with just ordinary people making ordinary decisions that had extraordinary results. Today, as we continue on in the book of Ruth, let's once again turn our attention to the first verse. Ruth opens with the words, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land." The first question we need to ask ourselves this morning is, why was there a famine in the land? Well, biblically speaking, there could be two possibilities, two reasons for the famine. Firstly, God could have used environmental conditions to cause a drought. So there could have been a literal famine caused by environmental conditions, i.e. no rain, leading to drought, which leads to no crops, which leads to famine. Or the second reason is it could be the result or the consequence of the Israelites' decisions. Simply put, the famine that was being experienced in the land of Israel could be because or a result of the people turning away from God. Moses warned Israel, and it shall come about, if you listen obediently to my commandments, which I am commanding you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, that he will give the rain for you, for your land in its season, the early and the late rain, and you may gather in your grain and your new wine and your oil. And he will give grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. You will eat and be full. And then he says, beware that your hearts are not deceived and you are not turned away and serve other gods and worship them. Or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land which the Lord is giving you. Deuteronomy 11. This is the second reason. And I think the thing that clearly stands out in Deuteronomy 11 is the fact that God laid before the people a choice. He said, obey and be filled, or disobey and experience famine. And when we turn to Judges 6, a scene unfolds that, and Judges 6 is within the time frame of the book of Ruth. But in Judges 6, we're given this vivid picture of what famine looked like in real time. In Deuteronomy, Moses says, God's given you a choice. Be obedient and be filled, be blessed. Disobey, and you won't be blessed. And we see this in Judges 6. Once again, we met with the familiar words, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And as a result, the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Midians for 7 years. Find that in the book of Judges. Now, Scripture tells us the Midianites and the Amalekites swept through the land, and in Judges 6, verse 5, we're told they were as thick as locusts. So there was a vast horde came down, and they devoured everything in sight, just like locusts do with the crops in the fields. They destroyed crops, they stole livestock, and Judges 6:4 tells us, and they left no sustenance for Israel. They left nothing behind. They stripped Israel bare. Now the situation was so desperate that the children of Israel made dens, dens in the mountains, and hid themselves in caves. Judges 6:6 sums it up. It says Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. Another translation puts it even more bluntly and says, so Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. Folks, being reduced to starvation is famine. And Ruth tells us there was a famine in the land. The nation was starving physically because she was starving spiritually. Israel was experiencing the famine because of the consequences of turning away from God. Because of the consequences of the decisions and the choices that they made in their lives. And if you read the book of Judges, it's the cycle of making bad decisions. You know, God sets up a judge, the land is blessed, the people are blessed, they're prosperous, and then they get, too big for their britches, and then they turn away from God. We don't need you anymore, God. And then they go into, they get taken over by a foreign nation. And then there's all sorts of trials and tribulations, and then they cry out to God, and God forgives them and raises up another judge, and it's all well with the nation for a while. And then they repeat the sin, and it's this endless cycle. Israel was experiencing the famine because of a consequence of turning away from God. Or as verse 1 tells us, because they were doing evil in the sight of the Lord. In Deuteronomy 11 and again in Deuteronomy 30, God set before his people clear choices. Life and death, good and evil, feast or famine. And it's really important that we understand that. God told Israel, you choose. And that choice will determine the outcome. Your choice will determine the outcome, feast or famine. Your choices will come with consequences. If they remain faithful to his word, they would experience blessing, provision, and protection. But if they turned away, if they chose to do it on their own, if they stopped listening, stopped obeying, stopped walking with God, then they would experience the consequences of their rebellion. One of those consequences being famine. Now, famine was never meant to be merely an agricultural crisis. It was meant to be a spiritual alarm. It was the visible evidence of an invisible problem. It was God's way of waking up the nation, calling them back to himself, reminding them that he alone was the source of life. He alone was the source of their blessing, their protection, And this is where the story speaks directly to us. Because the truth is that we have famine moments in our lives. Moments of pressure, lack, moments of fear. And those moments, those famine moments in our lives reveal what we truly believe about God. Israel's famine in Judges 6 exposed their hearts. It showed that they'd been living in disobedience long before the Midianites ever arrived. The famine and fear drove them into caves, hiding from the enemy, when it should have driven them into the arms of the Lord. Elimelech's famine in Ruth 1 exposes his heart too. It showed that when life became hard, he trusted in his own plan more than God's promise. And the truth is, the famine times in our lives do exactly the same thing. When the pressure rises, when the resources shrink, when the future feels uncertain, when we feel that we've been backed into a corner, that's when what we really believe about God comes to the surface. Famine moments in our lives peel back the layers. They show whether we will cry out to the Lord like Israel finally did in Judges 6:6, or whether we will quietly drift towards our own Moab, looking for relief in places God never intended us to get that relief from. Famine moments ask the question of us: will we stay in Bethlehem, the place where God has planted us, even when we feel empty, even when we're experiencing a famine? Will we trust that God can fill what feels barren? Or will we run like Elimelech to the nearest escape route? Because famine doesn't just test our circumstances, famine tests our faith. The famine in Bethlehem reminds us that God uses seasons of lack to draw us back to himself, to remind us that we're not in control, that we don't have all the answers, and that he is and he does. And the question that hangs over the text is the same question that hangs over our lives. When the pressure comes, when the famine comes, will we turn to God, or will we take the first exit to Moab? So with that backdrop, the darkness of Judges, the spiritual drift of the nation, and the famine that signaled God's discipline, we meet the first family in the story. Again, Ruth 1:1 tells us, "And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." Now, verse 1 tells us that a certain man, but in verse 2 we're given his name. It's Elimelech, and he was from Bethlehem, Judah. Now, Bethlehem means house of bread. And Judah means praise. We know from Ruth 1:1 there's a famine in the land. So there was a famine in the land because there was no bread in the house of bread. And there was no bread in the house of bread because there was no praise in the land. Bethlehem was the land God promised would flow with milk and honey. It was the land that he would use to feed his people, and where his provision and presence would be experienced. Yet Ruth begins with the house of bread has no bread. The land of praise had become the land of hunger. And the irony is intentional. It is the same pattern that we see in Judges 6, where Israel disobedience left them hiding in caves because the Midianites had stripped the land bare. You see, the famine in Bethlehem, the famine in the house of bread, was a visible sign of an invisible problem, a spiritual drought beneath the physical one. The house of bread was empty because the hearts of the people were empty. The land of praise was silent because the people had stopped listening to the one who they were meant to praise. Bethlehem, Judah, then becomes a living illustration of Deuteronomy 11 and chapter 30. God laid before his people a choice: life or death, blessing or cursing, fullness of famine. And here in Ruth 1, we see the outcome of their decision. And folks, Israel chose poorly. The house of bread is barren. The land of praise has become the land of lament. What God warned would happen is now unfolding before their eyes. Choose you this day whom you will serve. And in that emptiness, and in that barrenness, and in the midst of Israel's lament, God is calling his people back to himself, reminding them that he alone is the true bread, the true source of life. Folks, the famine is real, the pressure is real, the hunger is real. And in that moment of crisis, Elimelech makes a decision that will shape the rest of the book. He leaves Bethlehem. He leaves the land God promised to the nation. He leaves the land where God he leaves the land where God had chosen to dwell with his people. Instead of turning to God, Elimelech turns to Moab. Instead of repentance, he chooses escape. And instead of trusting God, he trusts in his own plan. He goes to Moab. And he takes his family. Now, on the surface, that may seem like a practical move. This is a loving father trying to provide for his family. A man looking for food. But spiritually, it was far more serious than that. Moab was not neutral ground. Moab was a nation born out of immorality, steeped in idolatry, and hostile towards Israel. God had warned Israel not to seek help from Moab, not to form alliances with them, and not to look to them for security. And this is who Elimelech went to for help. He went against everything that God had said. So Elimelech's decision is not just geographical, it's spiritual. It is a decision made under pressure, but outside of faith. It is a decision driven by circumstance, not by trusting God. And it's a decision that reveals where he believed his provision would truly come from. Now, Elimelech's choice here teaches us something really important. When we step outside of God's will to solve our problems, we often create bigger ones. And I'm getting old enough now to say I've seen this over and over again in my life and in other people's lives. When we step outside of God's will to solve our problems, we often create bigger ones. Wrong decisions made in desperate times rarely lead to right outcomes. Elimelech left Bethlehem seeking life, but he found death. He left the land of promise seeking security, but found only sorrow. He left the house of bread seeking fullness and ended up leaving his wife, Naomi, empty. And yet from Ruth we learn that God is still working even in the consequences of wrong decisions. I want you to think about that. And as we go through the book of Ruth, God takes this wrong decision and turns it around. That is an almighty God. Folks, human failure does not thwart God's plans. And in this case, it did not thwart God's plan for redemption. Elimelech's choice set the stage for Ruth's arrival, Boaz's kindness, Naomi's restoration, and the birth of a king. The birth of the King of Kings. But before we get to the redemption, we must sit with the reality. Famine reveals the heart, and decisions made in famine shape the future. Look at verse 1 again with me. And a certain man in Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now it's striking that in Ruth 1, Elimelech leaves Bethlehem for Moab. And in the verses 2 and 3, we learned that his sons end up marrying women from the land of Moab. So Elimelech leaves Bethlehem, goes to a land that God's told the children of Israel, I want you to have nothing to do with these people. Not only does he go to the land, his sons marry Moabite women, and yet the narrator never pauses to condemn them. There's no prophetic rebuke. There's no Elimelech went to Moab and his sons married women and this was evil in the sight of the Lord. There's none of that. No thunder from heaven. Instead, the text simply records the events and shows us the consequences. The silence is intentional and deeply revealing. In the book of Judges, God repeatedly names Israel's sins and sends judgment. But in the book of Ruth, God does something different. He lets the consequences speak. You see, Elimelech's name means God is my king. Yet his actions denied that truth. His actions do not show or demonstrate that God was king in his life. Much like our actions and our decisions can sometimes show that God is not king in our lives either. He leaves the house of bread for the borders of Moab, a land God warned Israel not to seek help from. He leaves behind the land of praise for the land of paganism. His sons marry Moabite women, something Israel was cautioned against, because whenever the Israelites married foreign women, they were led off into idolatry. And yet the narrator never steps in and says, this is wrong. Instead, the story quietly unfolds. Elimelech dies, Mahlon dies, Chilion dies, and Naomi is left empty. The silence is not approval, it's a narrative judgment. The consequences preach the sermon. And why would God do this? Because Ruth is not written like the book of Judges. Judges shouts, Ruth whispers. Judges exposes Israel's rebellion, Ruth reveals God's redemption. In Judges, God confronts sin directly. In Ruth, God shows how he can redeem even after the fallout of sinful choices. God shows how he can redeem even when we make the wrong choices. God does not condemn Elimelech with words, because the story itself shows the cost of leaving God's place and God's promises. The story itself shows the cost of leaving God's presence. But even more importantly, The silence creates space for something astonishing. God brings redemption out of Moab. The land that God said, don't go. The land that God said, stay away from. Don't seek their alliance. Don't seek their help. And yet, out of that land comes redemption. Out of the land Israel should never have trusted comes Ruth. Out of a forbidden nation comes faithfulness. Out of a Moab widow comes the lineage of David. And out of the story that begins with disobedience comes the lineage of Christ. God does not condone Elimelech's choices. He overrules them. He does not approve of Moab, but he redeems someone from Moab. He does not celebrate the family's drift. He uses their brokenness to write a better story. And the question is, why does that matter to us? Because we have our own Moab moments. Decisions that we make out of fear and pressure in times of famine in our lives. Choices that we regret. Paths that we should have taken or paths that we shouldn't have taken. We are all like Elimelech at times in our lives. We have our Moab moments. And yet Ruth shows us that God's grace is bigger than our missteps. I mean, this ought to be just thrilling your hearts, because don't we do that all the time? Don't we make mistakes? Don't we make missteps? And Ruth shows us that God's grace is bigger than all of that. He can take the consequences of our choices and weave them into his redemptive plan. The silence of Ruth is not God ignoring sin. Rather, it's God highlighting grace. The story begins with a man running from the house of bread and ends with God bringing the bread of life into the world through that very story. So Ruth opens with a famine, but it ends with a redeemer. It begins with emptiness, but ends with a child in Naomi's arms. It starts with a man running from the house of bread, but ends with God bringing the bread of life into the world. And all of that begins with one simple, sobering truth found in Ruth 1:1. There was a famine in the land. Famine is where the story starts, but famine is where God's work starts as well. Because famine moments in our lives are crossroads moments. Famine moments force a decision. They expose the heart and they reveal what we truly believe about God. Elimelech faced famine and he ran. Naomi faced famine and she became bitter. Israel faced famine and they hid in caves. But God used every one of those famine moments to call his people back to himself. And now the question comes to us. What do you do when your Bethlehem feels empty? When the place that God has planted you feels barren? When the prayers you prayed seem unanswered? When the pressure rises and fear whispers in your ear that God is not coming through? Do you run to your Moab? The quick fix, the easy escape, the place that promises relief but leads to emptiness? Or do you stay in your Bethlehem, trusting that the God who allowed the famine is the same God who can fix it, remove it? The same God that can take the famine and turn it into feasting. Ruth 1:1 is not just the beginning of an ancient story, it is the beginning of our story. Because every one of us will face famine moments, moments when faith is tested, when obedience is costly, and when trust feels hard. And in those moments, God is not absent. He is calling us, He is drawing us, and He is inviting us to return. The famine in Bethlehem is not the end of the story, it is the doorway to redemption. And the famine in your life is not the end of your story either. It may be the very place where God is preparing for you to do a great work. It could be the place where God is preparing to do His greatest work in your life. So the question that hangs over Ruth 1:1 now hangs over us. When the pressures come, when the famine comes, will we turn to God, or will we turn our eyes towards Moab? May we be a people who stay in Bethlehem. May we trust the King, and may we believe that even in famine, He is still working in our lives. Thank you this morning.